Haunted House of Souls. The Unbreakable Cycle of Terror. Hook. What happens when a house isn't just made of bricks, but feeds off your soul? A haunted house that traps anyone who dares to enter, and the cycle never ends. Are you brave enough to discover what waits in the shadows? Watch until the end, or you might be the next one to join them. The wind howled outside, pressing against the old, dilapidated walls. Inside, the house was silent. Too silent. Julia stepped forward, her footfall echoing in the vast emptiness. The floor creaked beneath her weight. A chill crawled up her spine, cold enough to make her shiver. She looked around, taking in the faded wallpaper peeling off the walls, the sagging furniture covered in dust. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. Every room seemed to close in around her. Her breath was shallow. She could feel the darkness pressing down, watching, waiting. Something wasn't right. A faint whisper drifted through the hallway, soft as a breath. Her heart skipped. She froze, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the wind outside. Julia continued down the hallway, drawn toward the stairs. The staircase loomed ahead, its steps cracked and uneven. She took the first step, then the second. The stairs groaned under her weight. The faint whisper came again, closer this time. Her skin prickled. It wasn't the wind. Something was here, something watching her. She reached the top of the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkened corridor. Each door seemed to whisper her name. The last door on the left stood ajar, just barely. A soft glow flickered from within, casting shadows on the floor. She pushed the door open, her heartbeat racing. The room was empty, but then her gaze fell on the mirror across the room. It was cracked. The reflection didn't match her. In the glass, a figure stood behind her. Cold breath swept down her neck. She spun around. Nothing. The room was still. Her hands trembled, fingers brushing the glass. The figure was gone, but she could feel it, its presence. A sudden sound, sharp, like nails scraping wood, came from the far corner. Julia turned, eyes wide. She saw nothing, but the air grew colder. Her breath fogged in front of her face. A low voice whispered, "Leave." It was close, too close. Her heart raced, her legs frozen, and then a shadow moved. The door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The whispers grew louder. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The walls seemed to close in. The temperature dropped even more. And the figure, it was standing right behind her now. She felt the weight of its gaze. Frozen in terror. The voice, no longer a whisper, now a growl, rasped, "You should have left." And the darkness swallowed her whole. The room spun around her, the walls closing in. Her breath quickened, shallow gasps piercing the suffocating silence. The figure was there, its presence heavy, oppressive. She could feel its cold, its dark energy. Every inch of her body screamed to run, but her legs refused to move. The shadow loomed larger, stretching toward her. Her heartbeat echoed in her chest, louder now. "Leave," the voice hissed again, more insistent. But her feet were glued to the floor. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Its face was featureless, just an endless black void. A chill wrapped around her, crawling into her bones. The air thickened, suffocating her. Something wet dripped onto the back of her neck. Julia flinched, spinning around. Nothing. Her hands reached up instinctively, but they only met cold glass, her fingers trembling against the mirror. The reflection now showed her, sweating, shaking, eyes wide with fear. But behind her there was movement. She could see it in the mirror, slow, deliberate steps. The figure was approaching. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was tight, choking on terror. The whispers turned into laughter, low, guttural, mocking. The cold seeped deeper into her skin. Her fingers grazed the cracked edges of the mirror. and then it spoke again, closer now. Too late. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. Darkness surrounded her, so thick it felt like she was drowning in it. Her pulse raced. In the silence, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the dark. She spun around, heart pounding in her chest. And then, in the deep void, she saw the faintest glimmer. A pair of eyes, empty, hollow, glowing faintly in the dark, staring straight at her. "Leave," the voice whispered, now full of hunger. But Julia couldn't move. She felt something tug at her, pulling her toward the darkness. A force stronger than her will, dragging her into the cold void. And then, with a sudden jolt, everything stopped. The house fell silent again. The temperature rose, and the whispering ceased. But Julia was no longer in the room. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark. The figure was gone, but the terror lingered. Something had changed, and the house had claimed another soul. The air around her felt thick, suffocating. Julia couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing but blackness. A deep, heavy silence pressed against her ears, until a flicker of light, a dim, eerie glow appeared in the distance, like a lantern swaying in the wind. Her heart hammered in her chest. It beckoned her. She took a step forward, the ground beneath her soft and uneven. With each step, the light grew stronger, clearer. But the closer she got, the more the shadows seemed to stretch around her. She felt it again, the weight of being watched. Every hair on the back of her neck stood on end. A whisper, sharp and low, brushed against her ear. "Don't." Her breath caught in her throat. She stopped, her body frozen. The light wavered, flickering like it was struggling to remain. But she couldn't resist. She took another step, then another. The glow grew brighter, illuminating the twisted walls of a narrow corridor. Something in the back of her mind screamed to turn back, but her body kept moving. The air was thick with dust, a strange, unsettling scent lingering. It felt as though the walls were closing in, narrowing the space with every step. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, an open door. A room, empty, save for the antique rocking chair sitting in the center. It rocked slowly, back and forth. But no one was there. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest as she moved closer. The chair creaked in a rhythm, like a lullaby. But something was wrong. It didn't sound right. A sharp pain pricked at the back of her mind. Then she saw it. The floor beneath the chair was stained dark, streaks of red. Her legs felt like they might buckle, but she couldn't look away. The door slammed shut behind her. She whirled around. There was no escape. Her eyes flicked back to the chair. And there, in the reflection of the darkened window behind it, she saw the face. The same face that had haunted her dreams. The hollow eyes, the blackened, twisted smile. The figure stepped from the shadows, and it spoke, its voice cold and hollow. "You're not leaving." Julia's breath caught in her throat. Her legs trembled, and she took a step back, but the walls seemed to close in. The figure moved closer, its presence suffocating. She couldn't see its features clearly, just the empty blackness that consumed its face. The air around her was thick with dread, each breath harder than the last. The whispering began again, low, maddening. "Stay. Stay with us." The words were like chains, wrapping around her mind. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting, twisting in unnatural ways. It was right in front of her now, and yet it seemed to grow even taller. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, as if her body was locked in place. Her pulse raced, blood rushing to her ears. The figure's hand reached out, cold fingers grazing her skin. A jolt of ice spread through her body. Her stomach churned, the sensation of being pulled, dragged into the depths of the room. And then a voice, no, a scream, erupted from within her. But it wasn't her voice. It was a scream from deep within the house, an agonizing, distorted wail. It echoed, reverberating through the walls, vibrating the very floor beneath her. Her chest tightened, suffocating. The figure's eyes were now visible, no longer empty, but filled with despair. A sadness so deep, it almost felt real. The thing spoke again, its voice dripping with sorrow. Trapped. We are all trapped. The words seemed to hang in the air like poison, heavy and unbearable. Julia tried to scream, but her throat wouldn't cooperate. Her breath was shallow, panicked. She felt the room spinning around her. And then, without warning, the world tilted. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor. The darkness swallowed her whole, dragging her under. There was no sound, no light, just the crushing weight of the void. And then the quiet. The oppressive silence that followed felt like a death sentence. For a long moment, she lay there, still lifeless, her mind locked in the dark. And then a whisper. It was faint, barely a sound, but it was there. Welcome home. The walls closed in tighter. And Julia was never seen again. The house felt alive now, the air thick with an unspoken presence. A low hum reverberated through the walls, as if the house itself was breathing. And in that silence, something stirred. Julia's eyes fluttered open, but the darkness was still all around her. She felt the coldness beneath her, the rough texture of the floor pressing against her skin. Her fingers twitched, but they couldn't move. A heavy weight pressed against her chest, suffocating her. She struggled, gasping for air, but it was as if the very air had turned to lead. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted around. There was no light, no sound, only the suffocating pressure of the house closing in. And then the whispers again, louder now, swirling in her ears like a tornado. Join us. Become one of us. The words slithered through her mind, like insects crawling beneath her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster now, her thoughts scrambling. She managed to raise her head, the movement sluggish, as though her body was fighting her. But then she saw them. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the corner of the room. They stared at her, unblinking, unrelenting. Her blood ran cold. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The eyes moved closer, the shadows stretching, reaching toward her. No words came, only the feeling of being pulled, of being consumed. And then the room began to shift. The walls twisted, bending in unnatural angles. The floor rippled beneath her, like water disturbed by a stone. Her body felt weightless, as though it was being lifted, drawn into the air. She tried to scream, but her mouth was full of silence. The shadows around her seemed to come alive, forming shapes, faces, indistinct forms. Whispers filled her ears, deafening now, pressing against her mind. Stay. Stay forever. Forever with us. The darkness grew deeper, colder. Her body, no longer her own, floated through the room as if guided by an invisible force. And the house was feeding. It was alive, hungry, pulling her into its depths. Every inch of her was submerged in the endless dark, until, at last, the eyes blinked, and Julia was gone, swallowed by the house. Just another soul lost. The house settled into an eerie stillness, the walls once again silent. But they seemed fuller now, like they were holding a secret, a dark weight. Outside, the wind continued its mournful howl. But inside, there was only the oppressive quiet. Julia was gone, but the house was far from empty. A new presence stirred in the shadows, as though something else had awakened. A shiver ran down the length of the hallway, an unsettling pulse that vibrated through the walls. The air grew colder. The faintest scent of decay lingered, clinging to the air. And then something shifted in the corner of the room. A faint rustle, almost imperceptible, like fabric dragging against the floor. The rocking chair that had once been still now moved gently, back and forth, back and forth, slowly. The shadows seemed to stretch in the corners, dark tendrils reaching, inching closer to the chair. Suddenly, the figure appeared again, this time not from the mirror, but from within the chair itself. It stood taller than before, the dark outline of its form swaying like smoke in the dim light. Its hollow eyes gleamed with something darker now, something new. The house had changed, and so had the entity that haunted it. The figure turned its head toward the hallway, as though sensing something. A faint, distant sound echoed down the hall, a soft, hesitant footstep. It paused, listening. Another footstep, closer. The door at the far end of the hallway creaked open slowly, almost as if it had been waiting. The light flickered once, then remained steady, and in the doorway stood a new figure, a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. The smell of fresh air clung to her, out of place in the suffocating stillness of the house. Her gaze swept the room, landing on the empty chair, then to the figure standing in the shadows. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back. But the figure's eyes, glowing and empty, met hers, and she felt it, the same pull, the same suffocating weight. Her heart thudded in her chest, her mind screaming for her to turn and run. But her body, it wouldn't obey. The figure moved, silent as death. A twisted smile spread across its face, as if it were waiting for her, anticipating her every move. And then, with a sudden jolt, she found herself walking toward it, unable to stop. The house had already claimed another, and the whispers returned louder now. "Welcome home." And the cycle began again. The woman's feet shuffled across the floor, slow, deliberate. Her eyes were wide, glassy, as if she could no longer see the room around her, but only the shadows calling to her. Her breath quickened, the fear mounting. But still, her body moved forward, as if it had a mind of its own. The figure in the shadows stepped forward as well, its dark form seeming to melt into the room. It was closer now, so close, the air grew colder still. The whispers circled her, wrapping around her like chains. "Join us." The figure reached out, its hand pale and skeletal, fingers twisted and long. It grazed her cheek, cold as ice. She flinched, her body trembling, but her legs carried her forward. The room seemed to stretch before her eyes, the walls bending in unnatural angles. The air felt thicker, heavier with every step she took. Her vision blurred, like the darkness was swallowing everything in its path. Her chest tightened, her heartbeat pounded in her ears. The chair, once still, began to rock again, slowly, steadily. Back and forth, back and forth. Each creak of the chair felt like a countdown, a ticking clock echoing in the silence. The woman stopped just in front of the chair. Her hands reached for it, almost instinctively. She felt a strange compulsion to sit, as though it were her place now, her destiny. But the chair wasn't empty anymore. As her hand touched the cold wood, a figure emerged from the darkness. A shadow wrapped in shadow, its form solidifying. It was Julia. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. Her lips were frozen in a silent scream, as if trapped in a moment of terror. The woman gasped, stumbling backward. "No," she whispered, her voice weak, trembling. But Julia's eyes, dark and hollow, turned to her, filled with an emptiness that swallowed everything. The whispering grew louder, maddening now. "Stay. Forever?" And with that, the woman's legs gave way. She fell to her knees, her body no longer hers to control. The figure reached out, pulling her into its grasp, and as she was lifted into the chair, the air around her seemed to close in, thick with darkness. Her pulse slowed, her vision grew dim, and in that final moment, as her mind began to fade, she heard the voice again. "Welcome home." And then the house was silent once more. A new soul, trapped in the walls of the haunted house, its cycle never-ending. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, the rocking chair continued to move, back and forth, back and forth. Waiting, the silence stretched, suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken things. The chair rocked, its creaking the only sound that dared to break the stillness. The woman, now seated in it, her body stiff, her eyes unblinking, was no longer aware of her own name. She was part of the house now, part of its darkness. And as the shadows around her deepened, the house seemed to settle in a way that felt almost content. But then, faintly at first, there was a sound. A soft scraping, like nails dragging against stone. The walls shuddered, as though the house was waking up again. A flicker of light pierced the gloom, fleeting, like a dying star. But it was enough to catch the eyes of the woman in the chair. Her gaze snapped toward the light. The room around her seemed to stretch in an unnatural way. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old rot. She blinked, her thoughts clouded, as if something were tugging at her, pulling her from the shadows. A figure stood at the doorway. A man. He was tall, with wild eyes, his face pale and drawn, as if he'd been through a storm and came out the other side broken. He was breathing heavily, his clothes torn, like he'd been running. And when he saw her, sitting motionless in the chair, something in his expression faltered. He stepped closer, hesitant at first, his eyes flickering nervously around the room. It was as though he could sense it, the house itself watching him, waiting. The woman's lips parted slightly, but she couldn't speak. Her eyes, once filled with life, were now empty. The man hesitated. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling, unsure. No response, but the whispers grew louder, faint murmurs just beyond his hearing. "Leave. Stay forever." The house seemed to breathe, its floorboards groaning under the weight of the past, of all the souls it had claimed. The man took another step forward, his eyes still locked on the woman, his pulse quickening. She was just sitting there, motionless. But the longer he stood, the more the shadows around him thickened. The whispers clawed at his mind, at the edges of his thoughts. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room plunged into deeper darkness. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no escape. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, more oppressive. A low growl, something ancient and hungry, vibrated through the room. The woman in the chair tilted her head slightly, as if noticing his presence for the first time. Her lips curled into a smile, wide, unsettling. A shadow passed over her eyes, dark and empty. The man stepped back, terror rising in his chest. And then the voice, no longer a whisper, but a low, guttural growl, rumbled from the walls, vibrating the very air around him. Asterisk, you belong here now, asterisk. The house had claimed him, and the cycle began again. The chair rocked, back and forth, back and forth. The house was never empty for long. The chair creaked again, its rhythmic motion a constant, unsettling sound. The man stood frozen, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. He could feel the weight of the house pressing against him, pushing him closer to the edge. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing, the air thick with something ancient and suffocating. He backed away, his eyes darting frantically from corner to corner, as though searching for any escape. But there was no escape. The house had already begun to claim him. The whispers filled his mind now, louder, clearer, each word a jagged blade in his thoughts. "Stay. Stay forever. Join us. Join us." The words became a chant, repeated over and over again, until they lost all meaning, just a chorus of madness. His head spun, the darkness in the corners of his vision growing. The woman in the chair shifted, her eyes never leaving him, those hollow orbs watching him like a predator. Her smile stretched wider, impossibly so, until her face was twisted in grotesque mockery. He felt his feet move before he could stop them. His body, like the others before him, was no longer his own. The chair was waiting for him, as if it had always been meant for him. He moved toward it, his legs heavy, his movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder with every step. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, but he couldn't stop. His fingers, almost numb, reached out for the chair, and as soon as he touched it, the house seemed to breathe as if it were alive. The moment his body sank into the chair, a heavy silence fell. For a brief instant, the house seemed to exhale, like it had claimed another soul. And then, the whispers returned. Closer now. Welcome home. The darkness swallowed him whole. The chair creaked once more, and the room fell into its eternal rhythm. Back and forth, back and forth. Another soul trapped, another cycle set in motion. And outside, the wind howled through the night. The house, alive with its hunger, waited for the next one to wander in. The rocking chair continued to move, back and forth, back and forth, and the house waited. Always waiting, the silence lingered, thick and heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The air grew colder still, each second stretching longer than the last. The chair rocked on its own, slowly and deliberately, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And somewhere, deep within the walls, there was a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Asterisk, another one will come, asterisk. The room was still, but the house was never truly quiet. It was always listening, always waiting. The man's body sat motionless, his eyes vacant, as if the house had drained all the life from him. His form was now another piece of the puzzle, his soul absorbed into the very bones of the house. And outside, the night pressed on, the wind howling and rattling the windows. But inside, the shadows deepened, thicker than before. A figure appeared in the doorway, standing just beyond the flickering light. A woman, her face pale, her expression distant, as if she had been walking for hours, lost in thought, unaware of how far she'd wandered. She stopped at the threshold, sensing the heavy, unnatural presence in the room. Her eyes darted to the rocking chair, where the man's still form sat, unmoving. But it wasn't just the chair that drew her in. It was the air, the thick, suffocating air that clung to her, as if it were pulling her in, closer to the darkness. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Stay, join us. The woman hesitated, her heart racing, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Something about this place, about the house, felt wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a gnawing unease that grew stronger with every breath. But still her feet moved. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the closer she got to the chair, the heavier the air became. The whispers turned into voices, no longer just a chorus, but individual voices pleading, demanding. Don't leave us. Asterisk, you belong here, asterisk. The woman's pulse quickened, her breath shallow as she took another step forward. She stopped in front of the chair, staring at the empty eyes of the man who had once been alive, now nothing more than a shell. Her hand hovered near the back of the chair, her body shaking as she fought the overwhelming pull of the darkness. And then she heard it, a whisper so close it felt like it was inside her skull. Sit. Without thinking, she turned, her fingers brushing the cold, worn wood. Her body moved as if possessed, her legs carrying her forward. The house, it was calling to her, and like the others before her, she could not resist. As her body sank into the chair, the air seemed to change. The walls groaned. The house exhaled as if it were alive, claiming her, pulling her in. And the whispers, oh, The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before. The chair rocked, back and forth, and the house settled once again, its hunger sated for now. But it would never be full, because the house was always waiting for the next one to wander in, the next one to be claimed. The room grew even colder, the shadows deeper, pressing in on all sides. The whispers had quieted for a moment, but the weight of the house remained, heavy, suffocating. The woman sat, her body frozen in the chair, her eyes wide but seeing nothing. The air felt thick with sorrow, with pain, an endless echo of the souls trapped within these walls. The chair rocked back and forth, like a heart that would never stop beating. And then another sound, a faint scraping, like something shifting in the distance. A door creaked open, slow, almost reluctant. But it didn't matter. The house was already awake, and something was coming. A new presence entered, this time a man, young, wide-eyed, his hands trembling as he stepped cautiously inside the hallway. He didn't notice the chair at first. He didn't notice the figure sitting motionless in it, the woman with eyes glazed over, lost. But as his eyes wandered the room, they fell upon the rocking chair. A shiver ran down his spine. He stepped closer, drawn in by some invisible force, like the pull of a distant tide. His feet carried him forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn back. The house watched him. It knew he was coming, had known all along. His fingers brushed against the doorframe, cold to the touch, and he flinched. The room seemed to close in around him. "Hello." His voice was thin, barely a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. No answer. But then the chair creaked again, back and forth, back and forth. The man's breath hitched. He felt it, the pressure, the suffocating weight of the house, a feeling of being watched, trapped. He glanced toward the woman in the chair. Her face was pale, drawn, her lips parted slightly as if speaking, but no sound emerged. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run, but his legs felt heavy, like they had been shackled. Something was pulling him in. His gaze moved to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to twist, shape-shifting in the dark. And then, just like that, he saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the corner, just beyond the reach of the light. Empty, hollow, staring directly at him. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest. The house, it was alive, alive and hungry. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. "Join us forever." His breath quickened, his mind screaming for him to leave, to escape. But the house, it had already claimed him. The shadows reached for him, tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the chair. His body moved against his will, his steps sluggish, like walking through thick mud. He reached the chair. The woman's vacant eyes met his, and her lips curled into a twisted, silent smile. The moment he sat, the house seemed to exhale, a cold gust of air sweeping through the room, and the chair, it rocked again, back and forth, back and forth. Another soul claimed, another part of the house's endless hunger satisfied. The cycle continued. The house never stopped. It was always waiting, always hungry, always watching. For the next one, the air in the room grew colder, the darkness deeper, as though the house had expanded itself, stretching to encompass more than just the walls around them. The man sat motionless now, his body slumped in the chair, his face pale, eyes unfocused, as though something had stolen his will to live. The chair continued its rhythmic rocking back and forth, back and forth. The house seemed to breathe in time with it, a deep, low sound like the groan of an old creature awakening from a long slumber. But there was something else now, something new, a presence, lurking just outside the reach of the light, something unseen yet undeniable. The whispers had returned, now louder than before, more frantic, like a growing crowd of voices pressing against his mind. Stay, stay forever. Asterisk, you belong here, asterisk. And then, from the darkness, another figure stepped into the room. A woman. Her face was drawn, weary, and her eyes held a deep sadness that seemed to reflect the very soul of the house. She had seen this place before, perhaps in her dreams or in stories whispered among strangers. But now, she was here, pulled into the house's grasp, just like the others. Her gaze swept the room, and her breath hitched when she saw the man in the chair. And then, her eyes fell on the woman sitting motionless, her vacant gaze never blinking. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The whispers intensified, rising like a wave crashing against her mind, pressing in on her thoughts. Join us. Become one of us. Her heart raced. Her limbs felt heavy, as though her body was betraying her. She stumbled forward, one step, then another, each movement slower than the last. The shadows, like tendrils, stretched out from the walls, wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward the chair. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't turn back. She couldn't stop. Her body moved on its own, driven by some force she couldn't understand. The closer she got to the chair, the more the air seemed to close in, suffocating her. The chair, unmoving just moments ago, now seemed to beckon. The figure sitting in it shifted, its empty eyes meeting hers. And then the smile, a slow, twisted smile that crept across the woman's face, stretching impossibly wide, as though her very soul was pulled into it. The woman's hand reached out, her fingers trembling, but they were drawn to the chair. Her hand brushed the cold wood, and a jolt of icy fear shot through her. She hesitated, but the shadows pressed harder, forcing her down. Her legs buckled. She collapsed into the chair, her body sinking into it. And as soon as she sat, the house exhaled again, this time a low, guttural sound like the very walls were satisfied. The rocking chair creaked again, its motion steady, back and forth, back and forth. The woman's eyes glazed over, her mind already slipping away into the void. She no longer saw the world. She no longer knew where she was. She was part of the house now. The cycle continued, unbroken. The house was always hungry, always waiting for the next soul to wander in. And the chair ever so patiently rocked, back and forth, back and forth. Always waiting, always feeding, the house seemed to breathe with a heavy, satisfied sigh, the weight of the souls trapped within its walls, making it feel like it was expanding, growing more alive with each passing second. The air was colder now, thick with the weight of the souls it had claimed, their presence lingering, pressing against the living, suffocating them in an invisible grasp. The woman in the chair, her body now stiff, her eyes vacant, sat motionless. She was no longer truly alive, not in the way she once had been. She had joined the others, a piece of the house, trapped in its never-ending cycle. The chair rocked steadily, back and forth, its rhythm becoming the heartbeat of the house itself. The whispers had slowed, but they were still there, faint, yet unmistakable. They hovered just at the edge of consciousness, like distant voices carried on the wind. Stay, they whispered. Join us. Forever. The house was never empty. Not for long. A new figure appeared at the door, hesitating at the threshold. A man, his face twisted in uncertainty, his eyes scanning the room. He felt the cold, the weight of the air, as though the very house was drawing him in. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body tingling with an unexplainable sense of dread. He had come searching for something, a story, a mystery, a thrill. But as he stepped into the house, something changed. The door creaked closed behind him, and the world outside felt distant, as though it no longer mattered. The shadows inside the room shifted, gathering in the corners, and the chair creaked, its rocking intensifying. Back and forth, back and forth. The man glanced toward the chair, his eyes drawn to it, as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. He saw the figures in it, two now, their hollow eyes staring, unblinking. The first woman, her face frozen in a silent scream, and the second, her eyes dull, her lips parted in a twisted smile. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs refused to move. The air grew heavier, thick with an invisible pressure that made every breath feel like a struggle. His pulse raced, his mind spinning with the weight of the house pressing in on him. And then the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like an insidious wind, crawling into his mind. Stay, stay, forever. He was already trapped. The moment he stepped through that door, the house had begun its claim. It had been waiting for him. The man's gaze turned back to the chair, drawn by an invisible force. He couldn't look away. The voices, the whispers, they were too much, too loud. His feet moved on their own, his body no longer his own. The shadows reached for him, wrapping around his limbs, pulling him toward the chair. His body moved against his will, his mind screaming, but his body obeyed the house. The moment his fingers brushed the cold wood of the chair, the house exhaled again, a deep, rumbling breath as though satisfied with its catch. The shadows closed in around him, and his vision blurred, his thoughts slipping away. He sat, and as soon as he did, the chair began to rock once more. Back and forth, back and forth. The house had claimed him. He was no longer a visitor, a wanderer. He was part of it now, his soul swallowed by its insatiable hunger. And outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was only the silence of the house, broken only by the steady creaking of the chair. Always waiting, always feeding, back and forth, back and forth. And the house, it waited. The house seemed to hum with life, its walls vibrating with the weight of all the souls it had swallowed. There was no escape now, no light at the end of the tunnel. The chair, ever steady, rocked in its endless motion, back and forth, back and forth. The man's mind was lost, drowned by the voices and the darkness that pressed in on him from all sides. His body was a husk, no longer his own, but a vessel for the house's hunger. His eyes were empty, staring straight ahead, seeing nothing but the endless night that had become his world. And yet, the house was still not satisfied. It never was. The shadows seemed to shift, writhing in the corners of the room, like something alive, something ancient, something that waited. A new presence. The door to the room opened slowly, its creak almost deafening in the silence. A man stood in the doorway, his posture rigid with fear. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything that might offer an escape from the suffocating dread he felt. But all he saw was the chair and the two figures sitting in it. The first a woman, pale and unmoving. The second a man, his body slumped as though drained of life. The rocking chair continued its motion, as if welcoming him. His pulse raced. He tried to turn, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place. The whispers rose again, louder now, wrapping around him like tendrils of smoke. Stay, forever. The house was feeding. The cycle was unbreakable. His gaze was drawn to the chair. He could feel its pull, an irresistible force, tugging at his very soul. Every fiber of his being screamed to turn away, but his body moved forward, against his will. The air grew colder, thicker, suffocating. And then the inevitable happened. His legs gave way. His feet carried him forward until he was standing in front of the chair, staring at the hollow eyes of those who had once been alive, their souls consumed by the house. Before he could react, his body collapsed into the chair, and in that instant, the house exhaled a long, slow breath of satisfaction. Back and forth, back and forth. The cycle continued. The house waited. Forever.